Jesus began to teach his disciples that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said to him, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Shall I take them? And so may God speak, and may our hearts be open to listen, either through me or in spite of me. Amen. It's really good to be here with you this morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to come and join you and preach here today. But I'd also, and probably most importantly, would like to thank you on behalf of our partners in the Middle East. It matters so much to our sisters and brothers. It matters so much to them to know that there are Christians in other parts of the world that are standing with them, that are praying for them, and are concerned about their welfare. The church in the Middle East often feels beleaguered and forgotten, and so when I visit and I can tell them that there's a church in Bristol that prays for them, it will truly gladden their hearts. I have seen adults weep when I've told them about the support that they get from the church in the UK. So it really does matter. So thank you very, very much. Now, the readings that were set for this morning would be super challenging at any time. But they are even more so in our current context where this awful war rages on in Gaza. As I said a few moments ago, Embrace works in Lebanon, Syria, Egypt and Iraq, as well as in Israel and Palestine. But as the war is so very dominant in our news, it seems appropriate this morning to explore the themes of our readings in the context of what is happening. As often happens with difficult Bible passages, the Church of England sanitizes them for Sunday use. So chapter 17 of Genesis has been edited in the lectionary, removing the particularly thorny verses that refer to God giving the land of Canaan to Abraham in perpetuity. All the references to circumcision have been removed, which of course suggests that it's only men that form the covenant. The problematic Ishmael disappears, and as does the assumption that having slaves is normal. I really urge you to go home and read the whole chapter this afternoon. But if we are to take the scriptures seriously, we must grapple with difficult passages and challenge ourselves with what they might mean for us today. Each of us will read the Bible through the lens of our beliefs about God. As a well-known preacher once said, what we believe about God determines how we believe God acts. So if we were to give Genesis chapter 17 to two Christians who have differing opinions about Israel and Palestine, we would probably get two different interpretations. Did God really give the land to Abraham and his descendants forever, meaning only the Jewish people? Or is there another legitimate interpretation? These are really choppy waters to navigate. But the theologian Colin Chapman has wise words to help us. I don't know if anybody's ever read Whose Promised Land? Has anybody ever read that book? Well, I highly recommend it. It's been recently updated. So Whose Promised Land by Colin Chapman. He suggests that it's very important for Christians to read the Hebrew scriptures, or what we would call the Old Testament, through the lens of the New Testament, rather than the other way round, so reading the New Testament through an Old Testament lens. Now, this morning we haven't heard the reading from Paul's letter to the Romans that was also set by the lectionary for this morning. But in it, Paul talks about Abraham being the father of all of us. Now, we have to remember that when Paul was writing to the church in Rome, he was writing to a congregation that was made up of both Jews and Gentiles. In Genesis 17, verse 7, we heard, "I will establish my covenant between you and your offspring after you." But of course, Abram, as he was at that point, went on to have two sons. Ishmael was already around in chapter 17, was the son of the slave woman Hagar. But then in chapter 21 of Genesis, we read that Abraham goes on to have Isaac by Sarah. It's worth going and reading this story because of what happens next. So Ishmael and Isaac are playing together. You can imagine two tots playing together when Sarah gets jealous and she has Ishmael and his mother sent away. But God promises Abraham that his firstborn son will still beget a great nation. So traditionally, this has been viewed as the point where the two great nations of the Arabs and the Jews split. And there are those in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam that state that this is the very beginning of the Middle East conflict. But this is the point where it's really helpful to look at this story through the eyes of the New Testament. Paul talks about the promise of Abraham resting on grace so that it is guaranteed to all Abraham's descendants. The promise given to Abram in Genesis 17 is articulated in circumcision. And if you read all of the chapter, you will see that Ishmael is circumcised. In other words, Ishmael is part of the covenant. Sarah's response to Hagar and Ishmael was very human. We fight. We get jealous. So it's no wonder that this incident is a useful metaphor for the Middle Eastern conflict. But in reading Genesis and Romans together, we see new possibilities. And dare I say it, we see hope. To bring the metaphor into the 21st century, both Israelis and Palestinians are descendants of the covenant. However, for this conflict ever to be resolved, it will require both sides to make sacrifices. Which brings me neatly on to this morning's gospel reading. In it, Jesus said, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life?" Sacrifice is what will give Israel and Palestine new life and new hope. And today, in that part of the world, Embrace's partners are making incredible sacrifices. They know firsthand what it is to take up their cross and follow Christ. Let me tell you about Musalaha. Musalaha means reconciliation, and it's an organization that works to bring together Palestinians and Israelis. Now, we're not talking about a cozy chat where everybody gets along very politely and nicely and then goes back to their own lives. This project brings people into the same space to resist injustice and oppression together. This work is hugely costly for everyone involved. Since the events of October the 7th, they have had to close their offices as they have been threatened by extremist groups. But despite the challenges, they keep pressing on. Even before October the 7th, they faced threats. An art exhibition showing work by both Palestinian and Israeli artists that was due to go on in the coastal town of Jaffa had to be cancelled, again because of death threats from extremists. I was last in Gaza in October 2022, and I spent a day at the Al-Atli Hospital, which of course made headline news earlier in the war. The medical director, Dr. Maher, who I spent time with on that day, lost his home very early on in the war, and the last I heard, he is sheltering in the Latin Church in Gaza City. It really pains me to think of him going hungry and thirsty alongside everyone else. He's a truly beautiful man of peace, and I will never forget the conversation I had with him. We are all made in God's image. We are all God's children. It's why we must find a way to share this land. I could tell you many more stories of people who are prepared to make sacrifices. People who are willing to take up their cross and follow Christ. It's hugely costly. And these sisters and brothers of ours are a shining example to all of us. So thank you for all you are already doing to support them. And let's keep them at the forefront of our prayers. Let us learn from their example of costly discipleship, and let us stand in solidarity with them as they shine as beacons of light in very dark times. Amen.